Please turn in it to Acts chapter 25. This is where we'll spend our time today. I was reading this week and I saw this interesting story. It was a man in Sweden who went to a car dealership. He was a fisherman and he came off his boat. He was still wearing the yellow kind of overall thing they wear made out of rubber and rubber boots. He didn't look particularly important, but he walked down into this car dealership, was walking around the parking lot looking at various vehicles. And he stopped, and the people in the office really weren't paying him much attention until he stopped in front of this one vehicle. He stood there for a long time, so they thought, well, I guess we need to go out and see what he's doing. And so they went out there and they talked to him for a few minutes, and the fisherman said, I want 16 of these. And the car dealer said, right. You want 16 of those. Oh, let me run right out and get those for you. And kind of made fun of him. Didn't take him seriously. Just thought, this can't be right. And left him standing there. Just walked off from him, as I've had that happen to me. And the car dealer just said, that's it, I'm not dealing with this guy anymore, and left him standing out there. And he stood there for a few minutes. He walked across the street to another car dealership. Well, about 2 hours later, the people in the first dealership happened to look out the windows and they saw those two tractor trailers, car carriers with 16 cars, all of the same model in different colors on the trucks. The guy was a pollock fisherman. He'd come straight off the boat. They had a $750,000 pollock haul, and the whole crew of 16 said, let's all go get new cars. So things don't look like what we expect. Things look different. Sometimes they appear different than they really are. And this is kind of where Paul is in his life. The people that he's dealing with, the people that he's standing in front of, none of them take him seriously at all. He's just this little short, as the tradition has it, bald-headed Jewish guy. Kind of old. Kind of had a hooked nose according to the tradition. He wasn't somebody that you'd walk by in a crowd and think this is an important person. He doesn't look like that. But God is working in him. Porcius Festus, the governor of Judea, is in a pickle right now because he knows there's no reason for me to hold Paul any longer. None at all. I've got no legal reason. There's no legal reason this guy should have been in jail for 2 years. And as the governor of Judea, he knows some other things too. First of all, he knows that Judea is a very difficult province to be the governor over because they're clamorous, they're militantly monotheistic, they don't like pagan influences, and they don't like the Romans, and the Romans don't like them. And so Judea is a really hard province to govern. So Porcius Festus has that problem. He also knows that he wants to try to make them happy because he doesn't want any trouble. And so he's in a bind now. And further than that, why is Paul even here? Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 13 of chapter 25. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. And since they were spending some days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king and said, there's a man who Felix left here as a prisoner, and when I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews had brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned to death. And I told them it's not the Roman custom to hand over anybody to before they face the accusers and have a chance to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I didn't delay the case. I took it up right away, but convened the court the next day and ordered that Paul be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him with anything that I had expected. Instead, they talked about some points of their law, some religious disputes, and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul said was alive. I was at a loss as to how to investigate these matters, so I asked that Paul, would you be willing then to go back to Jerusalem and face your charges there? When Paul made his appeal then to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear Paul myself. He said to him, "Tomorrow you will." The next day, Agrippa and Bernice arrived with great pomp and ceremony and attended the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. And then Festus commanded that Paul be brought in. Festus said, "King Agrippa and all of you who are present with us today, you see the man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to be allowed to live any longer. I found that he'd done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I've decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing to write about in my report to his majesty. Therefore I've brought him before all of you, and especially you, King Agrippa, because as a result of this investigation that I might have something to write. For I think it unreasonable to send a prisoner to Caesar without specifying some of the charges against him." So he's just in a pickle. Festus doesn't know what to do. He's smart. He's the governor. He understands Roman law. What am I sending Paul to the emperor for? What are the charges? Festus has made a state visit to Jerusalem, and now Agrippa comes back to Caesarea and makes a state visit to Caesarea to visit Festus there in his governor's palace. Agrippa is the king of the Jews. He's called a king, King Agrippa II, but he's not really a king. Now this is fascinating. The Romans were very good at this. They would allow people of certain denominations, certain demographics, they would allow them to have rulers appointed of their nationality, of their ethnicity, who would be rulers in title alone. It's kind of like the King and Queen of England. They don't decide anything. They just look good and do stuff, and a lot of money comes into the palace on account of them. But they're not statespeople. They're symbols. And King Agrippa was like that. He knows that his only authority as a king is in title only. He doesn't have any power to affect anything. But King Agrippa is an interesting person in Roman history. He has been educated in the emperor's palace. He was raised, given over to Claudius at a certain age, and raised in Claudius, the emperor's home. So he's well educated. He knows Roman law. He knows Roman tradition. He's also a Jew. And so he knows Jewish law and Jewish tradition. And so for Agrippa to be here on this particular day is very advantageous, because now we've got somebody who understands Jewish law. Festus does not. He's mystified by all of this. Festus just wants fair play for Rome. He wants justice to be done. And in some ways, Festus's desire for justice is actually dangerous for Paul. And you see that in the text. He says, "Paul, why don't you just go back to Jerusalem, where the people who understand what these charges mean can then put you on trial there?" Well, Paul knows that's not going to work. I mean, it's logical legally to send him back, but he knows, first of all, there was a plot to kill him on the way to Caesarea 2 years ago. And the funny thing is, that plot was by what were known as the dagger bearers, the zealots. When you see that word, one of the apostles of Jesus was Simon the Zealot. The zealots were people that would kill you if they thought it would further Israel's move into dominance in the region. If it would get rid of the Romans, if it would solve the problem they have of self-determination in government, they would kill you to do that. As a matter of fact, in 66 AD, when the Jewish wars took place, and they surrounded, Titus the general surrounded Jerusalem, surrounded the whole city, and built that berm up around it and locked everybody in there and tried to starve them out. The zealots were killing their own kinspeople, because some of the people were saying, they've made an offer. Titus made an offer that if we'll just come out to the wall and surrender, nothing will happen to us. And so some of the Jewish people were saying, boy, looks bad for me now. Let me climb up and surrender myself, wave the white flag. The zealots, the Jewish people inside the walls, were killing their own people because they just did not want to do anything that looked like surrender to Rome. This is how serious these people are. So you can imagine, remember when Paul went from Jerusalem to Caesarea? They sent 470 soldiers with him on the way. That's a lot. I mean, nobody gets that many soldiers today, even in this country, around one person. Well, they did so because the zealots were plotting to kill Paul. Well, now it's not just the zealots. The Jewish council are in on the deal now. They want to see Paul put to death. Festus doesn't know anything about this. So Paul's in more danger than ever because Festus is saying, why don't you just go back to Jerusalem and face the Jews? They're the ones who have the problem with you, not me. And Paul says, no, I'm going to Caesar. Well, now Festus's hands are tied. He's got to allow Paul, as a Roman citizen, to go to Caesar. And plus, if Paul knows that if Festus got his way and sent him back to Jerusalem, there wouldn't be 470 soldiers going with him. Might be a couple. Well, they would never survive the trip back. Festus is utterly mystified by all of these charges but one. There's only one charge given to Paul that he's accused of that says this is worthy of the Romans getting involved, and that's the charge of sedition. But Paul's innocent of that. And Festus is aware of all of this. Agrippa comes, and Festus is hoping now that they're both going to hear Paul, and that Agrippa, because of his knowledge of Judaism, will understand why it is that Paul is accused in the way that he is. Agrippa is an interesting person, not only in Jewish history, but Roman as well, because he made everybody mad. He married his own sister. Nobody liked that. The Jews didn't like it. The Romans didn't like it. Nobody's good with that. They don't like you marrying your own blood sister, but this is exactly what Agrippa has done. And this goes back to this whole idea of, the king can do whatever he wants, I guess. You can just, if you want to marry your sister, you think she's the best you can do, then that's what you're going to do. So that's what he did. But he understands Judaism, so it's a good thing that he's there. Festus's desire for justice here actually places Paul in a worse situation because he might go back to Jerusalem anyhow. That could happen. Now, Agrippa's understanding of the Jewish law is going to come in handy here when he actually hears Paul. He'll be able to adjudicate some of the things that have been given as charges. But in some ways, Paul has lifted this whole thing out of their hands by saying, I appeal to Caesar. And now all of the Roman machinery has no choice but to allow him to go. So that's where we are. That's where Paul is right now. And you've got this, again, this little Jewish guy standing with all these soldiers, King Agrippa and all of his finery, his wife and all her finery, Festus and his finery. He's got on his purple robe. When you sit down on the bema seat, the judgment seat, as the governor, you put on certain clothing. And you got all those guards with the gleaming uniforms holding that helmet. Everything just looks totally nice and rich and full of all kind of pomp and circumstance. And then there's little old Paul standing there, who Rome doesn't care about and the Jews want dead. He's in a bad place. And this is where this text, we could just stop there and say, oh, isn't all that history very interesting? And it is. It's interesting to me. But there are different ways to read the Bible. If you watch a butterfly when they get on a flower, when they light on a flower, you'll notice they're too big, so they just stand on the edges of the flower petals and they stick that long proboscis, that tongue, way down in the bottom. That's how they get at the nectar. But when you see a honeybee, the honeybee gets in the flower and crawls all the way down to the bottom because their tongue is very short and they can't reach what's down there. That's the way sometimes the Bible has to be read. We have to get down and dig a little bit to find out what it is that it would say to us regarding our lives. Paul is exhibiting something about his life that I would say we need in our life today. He doesn't shrink from the responsibility that he has as somebody that belongs to Jesus ever. No matter what situation he finds himself in, he finds a way, whatever the platform is, whatever that situation in which Paul discovers himself to be, he's going to relate the gospel. He's going to say, what has Jesus done for me? Always. If you go back and look at all of the testimony of Paul throughout the book of Acts, what you see in every instance is Paul relates everything to what Jesus has done in his life. He seizes the day. He takes the platform where he is. He doesn't wait for what we would say would be a better place to be, a better platform. Now, I don't know what it's like for you. But for me, I've only had a couple of times in my life where the platform has been laid out for me such that I could talk about Jesus in a way that it just was clear to me that's what I was supposed to do. Now, one of them was a guy that was 48 hours from death. And he looks up at me and says, I've gone the wrong way all my life. I need Jesus. Well, that's a pretty clear invitation. I mean, I didn't have to think very hard about what I should do in that moment. But those are rare. Most of the time, we're in here, or we're in the store, or we're downtown, or we're in a social encounter. And the idea of talking about what the Lord is doing in our lives is just kind of foreign. It doesn't fit. How many of us would, don't raise hands, but I mean, I know for me, this is how it is. I can think of many times. I will have relatives coming in and I'll pray, Lord, give me a chance. Let me be able to see it, the right time to talk to them. And it never comes. And I just let the whole week go by and never have one conversation. It doesn't have to be, do you know what's going to happen to you when you die? It doesn't have to be that or turn or burn or whatever. It just, this is what life is like for me. If the Lord of life lives inside me, then all of who I am is affected by that. And so every place where I am is an opportunity to say something, but I'm just too dull. It just goes right by me. I don't see it, and I'm waiting for that really good spot where I see the door swung open nice and wide and the light's pouring in, and I know that I'm to go through that door and talk to this person about what Jesus has done for me. Paul doesn't wait for any of that. Paul just, every opportunity he has, no matter what it's going to cost him. I think about it in terms of just this few people in this room. When we see somebody in the congregation and we look at them and we know, human beings, we're just like kitties and doggies and horsies, and we know when something's wrong with somebody. We can feel it. We can look at them and say something is not right. Do we offer that hand on the shoulder? Do we do what Jesus said? Do we become salt and light in that instance? There's the platform that's been set for us. But for me, I got to tell you, I just miss it so often because my mind is consumed with other things. Living for Jesus, being salt and light in this world, it's not right here a lot of the time. I'm consumed, as I was last night and yesterday, with all of the things that are in front of me to do. How am I going to fit them in? How am I going to make it happen? How am I going to get this done? How am I going to get that done? And the thought of actually being salt and light for anybody is very distant. How many of us get into that predicament and we snap at somebody we love because we're just caught up? Who's salt and light now? Not me. I'm too busy. Right? And then you see Paul. He's been sitting in chains for 2 years. And they march him into this room in the chains. Just imagine the imagery and all these fancy things around him. They march him in, and what does he do? He's going to do the same thing he's been doing all along. It's all right here for him. This is what Jesus has done for me. I think about it, and I look back in history, and I see these various people in the Bible, and I just think, I'm missing a lot of this stuff. Daniel, he's deported to Babylon from Judea. Nebuchadnezzar, back then, what they did, it was smart. They took the best and the brightest. They brought them back to Babylon. They left all the peasantry in Judea. These poor people who are just dirt farmers, we don't want them. Let's get all the really smart people and haul them back and turn them into Babylonians. That's what they did. So Daniel's one of those. He's in Nebuchadnezzar's court. They recognize that Daniel's got some gifts that they don't understand. Nebuchadnezzar's got a whole group of people on the court payroll to tell him stuff that he doesn't know. Astrologers and soothsayers and fortune tellers and magicians and everything else. All these people are supposed to be really wise about stuff. They're on the payroll. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. You can read about it in Daniel chapter 2. He has a dream. He wakes up, he recognizes the dream is important, he wants it interpreted. So he calls all those smart guys in. And they say, well, okay, king, you've had a dream, tell us the dream and we'll interpret it for you. He says, oh no, I'm seeing through you. It's kind of like, how many of you know who Uri Geller is? Anybody remember Uri Geller? Yeah. It's an Israeli. As soon as I describe what he does, you'll remember. He was supposed to be able to bend stuff with his mind. He'd take a spoon, he'd look at it, he'd touch it with his finger, and then it'd roll over like it was made out of hot plastic. It just bend over. And I watched him do this for a long time. One time he was on this talk show, and they were just interviewing him. And they didn't have there was no notion that he was going to be asked to do his thing, which is bend spoons and knives and forks. And all of a sudden this lady walked out with this tray just covered with all these articles that in his act normally he would bend. And he looked a little surprised, and the host said, yeah, Uri, we thought, well, we've got you here. Why don't you bend a few things for us? So they set the tray down, and so what are you going to do? I mean, if you're Uri Geller, you're going to pick up the fork, you put it in your hand, rub it, stare at it really hard, start rubbing it, and then he puts it down. He says, I'm not feeling the energy today. Well, this is what Nebuchadnezzar's doing. He's saying, okay, guys, no, I'm not going to tell you the dream. You tell me the dream and then interpret it. And they're going, oh my gosh. And by the way, if you don't, I'm going to kill all of you. Man. So Daniel comes in, and Nebuchadnezzar tells him the same thing. And Daniel says, this is where it's got to be right here. It's got to be because we are so filled up with God that this is the first thought we have. Daniel says, you know what, King? There's a God in heaven who knows these things. I'm going to ask, give me a day, I'll ask him, and then I'll tell you the dream. Now, boy, you talk about sticking your neck out. Paul's neck is out. Daniel's neck was out. And what's so fascinating about it is Daniel does not, he's just like us. He doesn't know whether God's going to give him that answer. There is no guarantee. God, what's the dream? And then what's the interpretation? And even if God gives it to him, he's going to go back into Nebuchadnezzar's court, and Nebuchadnezzar might say, yeah, that's the dream, but I don't like what you said. Off with your head. In other words, here's Paul, here we are. There is so much of our lives that are just not in our control. We think they are. Right? We all came here today. We had control over that. Our bodies are functional enough we got here. Probably we'll go home. We don't know any of that. There is not 1 second of breath that you and I have. And I think about this a lot. The older I get, the more immediate it seems to me. Not 1 second of breath that you and I have that's not a gift from God for that second. I don't see it that way, though, do you? I walk around this world just thinking this is life. Oh, well, here I am. It's all I've ever known. What if, and this speaks so much to what we talked about in Sunday school today, what if we would say, all right, I understand that life's not in my control, but what am I going to do about it? What if we were to turn this all around and go right to the bottom of it and say to God, you know what, Lord? James says you can ask God for wisdom and he'll give it. And I love that verse. I love that because it just feels right to me. Yeah, God, I need your wisdom. I need it right now. Standing here today, I can tell you, I have prayed that prayer a bunch. But in asking it, then James says, but if the person who asks is double-minded, don't expect that they'll receive anything from God. Oh, I hate that part. I don't like that part because I am double-minded. What if we were to ask God for that? God, help me to believe. Give me the wisdom to know that you can be trusted. Change my heart in that way. Start there. What parent, if a child came to them with a question to them about trusting them as a parent, would not want to do something to have that trust be built? I think God is exactly the same way. A good person wants to be trusted. Right? Mm-hmm. God's a good person. He's a good person. He doesn't want us to doubt. He wants us to trust him. I want to learn that.